The following podcast contains information and real stories about sexual assault and or violence which may be triggering to survivors.
From sporting
in the morning newspapers, a third allegation of sexual assault. By afternoon,
had to
a
fight to
fourth.
share her story of sexual abuse.
Bravery and the strength of Grace Tame.
Another
and
former
people like
staffer
her.
alleging the man had run his hand up her thigh in a
haven't seen
bar.
this process of child grooming.
After a rape allegation and a question-time sex scandal.
woman who bled heavily.
In 2016, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimated that 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced some form of sexual crime since the age of 15. On top of that, most major studies indicate that 25% of young women between ages of 15 and 21 will experience some form of sexual crime within that 6-year time frame. This is far too high. In a time where the world is changing so fast, sexual crimes seem to be regularly dominating the news, which begs the question, why is this and how can we help prevent it? I'm your host, Byron, a 22-year-old podcaster from Sydney, Australia. Join me as I interview Brent, one of Australia's most respected communicators in the field of sexual crime, criminal profiling and personal safety in secondary schools and universities. He may have been to your school. Having spoken to over 900,000 students on the subject, this podcast aims to educate young people around the reality of sexual crimes and the severity of these crimes. Together, we explore the legal definitions as well as the ethical and moral, wrapping these up in metaphors and stories in an easy to listen to and easy to understand way. Welcome to this episode. Welcome back to the podcast with Brent Sanders again, and today is our final episode for this season. We're going to be talking about the consequences. So we've gone through the introduction, we talked a bit about stranger danger, some other things. We then went into consent, assumption versus confirmation. We went into age. We went into drunkenness, a few other things. But now we want to talk and definitions. But now we want to talk about the consequences of these crimes, because they're very serious crimes and they have very serious consequences. This is something, as I mentioned, another big aha moment or wow moment for me when I attended your presentation. I was like, oh my God, I did not realize the consequences were so severe for these crimes. So I think it's important that people understand the consequences of these crimes, and it really makes you realize, okay, these are actually very serious. Like these are, very serious crimes. So I guess, where do you want to start with consequences?
Yeah, look, we hear a lot. I mean, a lot of the focus of when I talk about this is very much focused on, quite rightly, the consequences to the target of these offences, the consequences that this has on the person who is subjected to these crimes. We've interlaced a lot of our chat, I think, around that, and that's something I do in my talks. But of course, you're right. We also, I think it's appropriate to say, okay, what are the consequences facing a young person who chooses to cross this line? And when we talk about a young person committing sexual crime in the age group that I present to, it is almost exclusively young men. Not because the law says only young men can be held liable for committing sexual crime, but because all research and statistics tell us that in the age group that I'm addressing, 15 to 21 and around there, almost exclusively sexual offences are committed by males, not by females. Now, from a legal perspective, there's no difference. The law does not say a sexual offence is where a male does this to a female. It says it's when a person does this to another person. I mentioned way back during our introduction that one of the things I talk about when I talk to young men in my talks is I say, guys, there was a time where you were at greater risk than young women of the same age. Now, that's primary school. And when we look at primary school sexual crime, the most common type of sexual crime is a young boy being targeted for a sexual offence by an adult male. So that's a male-to-male crime. The law doesn't make any distinction really between that and male to female, female to male, male to male, female to female. So when we talk about consequences, of course, we're talking in this context, we're talking about the consequences to a person who commits a sexual offence. And in the age group that listen primarily to this podcast and that I present to, it is usually men. Now,
and also there's consequences of both sides, right? We've got the consequences of who was a victim. They've got to deal with these repercussions for potentially, you mentioned earlier on, the rest of their life.
Massive. And this is where a massive focus is in what I do and what other people do. But also, we've got to look at the consequences to the victim of a crime have been inflicted upon them by the person who's committed it. and the person who's committed it is facing potential consequences as well. Now, the other thing I want to say as we get into this is this is not me saying a person who's had a sexual offence committed against them has to report it, has to lay charges. You don't. That is a choice. But if you choose to report a sexual offence, when you're reporting a sexual offence, it's the same test for reporting any crime. The question that's asked at the time of an interview is basically, is there a reasonable cause to suspect that a crime or crimes have been committed against this person? So that's the only thing the person reporting has to, that's the only test they have to pass. Oftentimes people are discouraged from reporting by well-meaning friends who mistakenly think when you report a crime, you have to prove the crime at the time of reporting it. You don't, and you probably can't. That would be like me leaving here today, discovering that my car has been stolen, reporting it to the police, and the police saying, oh, we're only going to investigate it if you can prove who stole your car.
It's their job, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I don't know who stole my car. It's been stolen. That's why I'm reporting it.
Yeah.
Same principle for sexual crime. Now, look, there's been a lot of discussion recently, the last 3 or 4 weeks, about low reporting, a lot of criticism of the system and things such as that. And it's all valid criticism. It's all valid discussion. However, alongside that, we have situations that go to court where a person is found guilty and they are subjected to the full weight of the law. I've given evidence in many, many sexual crime cases where the offender has been found guilty and has been subjected to the full weight of the law. Overnight, we have one of the highest profile rugby league players in Australia who's been found guilty of 2 sexual assaults, 2 rapes. Each one carries 14 years. He's now awaiting sentencing. He'll be sent to prison for a substantial period of time. So yes, we can always make the system better. Yes, some people choose not to report. Yes, some cases that are reported fall over and don't get to court. Some that get into court fall short of being proven beyond reasonable doubt. But let's talk about when a sexual crime case is reported, investigated, the offender is taken to court, and they're found guilty. The consequences for being found guilty of a sexual offence are huge.
And as usual, it varies, doesn't it? Varies.
It does, and it's a really good point. And I might just, by way of example, look at a couple of figures with regards to consequence under New South Wales law.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are differences as we go state to state, as there are differences with terminology, and we've mentioned this in our earlier podcast, and I hope that between you and I we've done a decent enough job to sort of not confuse people, but also respect that what we call this in this state can be called something different in another state. And yes, you're right. There are variances in imprisonment times for, say, for example, sexual offences state to state. What does remain fairly consistent is the average imprisonment terms which are given.
Yeah.
So, as an example, New South Wales. Let's look at that as an example. But if you want a clarification, as you mentioned earlier, Byron, you can certainly do this by going online, and whether you're in South Australia, Victoria, whatever. New South Wales, if you are charged with sexual assault, which is rape, that is sexual intercourse without consent. Using a very recent case, Jared Hayne was found guilty of 2 sexual assaults against that one girl. If you're found guilty of 1 sexual assault in court in New South Wales, you can face a maximum or up to 14 years imprisonment.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't mean everybody found guilty of that crime gets 14 years. It means that 14 years is the maximum, and that is reserved for versions of that crime which meet the worst versions of that criteria. Yeah? If you commit 2, you're looking at 28 years. If you commit 10, you're looking at 140 years. I profiled an American sex offender by the name of Ronnie Sheldon, who was charged with 229 sex crimes.
229.
He was found guilty of 220, and he received the maximum imprisonment term for each one. And he was imprisoned for 3,198 years. So what we see, that's an extreme version, but that's the principle being applied.
Yeah.
That the more crimes you commit, you just the incarceration time equates to the number of crimes that you commit. Ivan Milat was facing, I think he got 7 or 8 life sentences. Now, he's not going to live 7 or 8 lives, but he got 7, maybe 8 life sentences because he murdered 7 or 8 people. So he got a life sentence for each one. And when we look at why courts do that. Why would a court issue one sex offender in America aged 27 with an imprisonment term of 3,198 years? It's got nothing to do with the offender, nothing. It's got everything to do with respecting the victims of his crimes.
Right.
So each one
Is represented.
is represented in the imprisonment term. So the Ivan Milat case, he received life imprisonment for each of the people he killed. It's a respect to the victims, to their families, and things such as that.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So we come back to rape, sexual assault, sexual intercourse without consent. Let's use the New South Wales terminology just for the sake of this. It's a sexual assault. Let's remember also what we're talking about here, and we raised this, Byron, didn't we, in earlier discussions. Sexual assault, sexual intercourse without consent, has been committed if you penetrate somebody with one or two fingers without their permission. If you get somebody to perform oral sex on you without their permission. That is a crime that carries a maximum imprisonment term of up to 14 years for one. 14 years for each one which is committed. Now, just on that, in New South Wales, we've had for some 10 years or so in the legal process what is called a standard non-parole period. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down on this, but it's part of the whole issue of consequence for committing crime. Standard non-parole periods are imposed on serious crimes under New South Wales law. Now, this may occur in some other states. I'm not 100% sure, but all of your listeners may get some value from this. The reason that these were put into place is to recognise that society has a certain expectation of imprisonment for certain serious crimes. Sexual assault, rape, is a serious crime. So in New South Wales, if you're found guilty of sexual intercourse without consent, you can face up to 14 years imprisonment. If you are over 18 at the time of committing that offence, the recommended standard non-parole period is 7 years. Now, what this means is it's not technically a mandatory minimum sentence of 7 years. It's a very strongly worded guideline to judges that says if in your courtroom a person is found guilty of sexual assault, rape, and they were over 18 at the time, they should serve no less than 7 years, no parole. And if a person gets less than 7 years who's over 18, there would need to be mitigating circumstances as to why that standard non-parole period wasn't met. So we do that for serious crimes. Just on this, sadly, it is not uncommon for me to have reported to me a sexual offence that occurs, say, at a party or at a social event where, for example, more than one offender is present. So you could have a young girl, and it's usually young women, sadly, that's in a bedroom, taken into a bedroom with a guy, and he's joined by one of his friends. Right. So we have two guys in a room, and that girl in that room is subjected to sexual intercourse without consent. Under law, both of those boys can be charged. And this now becomes aggravated sexual assault in company. Aggravated, just a legal term for more serious. Now, once we put the word aggravated in front of any crime, it increases the imprisonment level. So using New South Wales law as a guideline, but all states and territories follow a similar pattern. Aggravated sexual assault in company, the imprisonment term goes from a 14-year maximum up to 20. And the standard non-parole period, if those boys are over 18, is 10 years as opposed to 7. Yeah? Now, we do have, and I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, we do have a couple of aggravated sexual assaults under New South Wales law that actually carry life imprisonment. These are sexual crimes committed against children. These can be sexual crimes committed in company where a target of the crime is abducted, taken to another location and subjected to like a gang rape. These now carry life imprisonment. Now, life imprisonment in New South Wales means just that. You can be sent to prison for the term of your natural life.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I thought life was like 40 years or something.
No. There are some states, Queensland is one, where life imprisonment is actually a 15-year judicial time frame. New South Wales, after Truth in Sentencing 1991-92, life imprisonment became life imprisonment. Meaning if you get it, that can mean you're in prison until you die.
Wow.
So there are a couple of top-end forms of sexual intercourse without consent that attract that sentence. So basically, sexual intercourse without consent, if you're found guilty, you can go to prison for up to 14 years. If you're over 18, you'd be looking at a standard non-parole period of 7 minimum. Then we drop down to remember in our earlier chats, Byron, we've spoken about a question that often comes up in my talks. What if it doesn't go that far?
Yeah.
You
like
know?
indecent assault.
Yeah, exactly. Indecent assault, or, sometimes called unlawful sexual touching. Now the imprisonment term maximum drops from 14 years in New South Wales down to 5. Now, just by way of comparison, if we look at the ACT, it's 3 hours drive south of here, sexual assault attracts a maximum 12 years, but then they have some versions where it goes up, like aggravated, 12. Indecent assault in the ACT carries a maximum 7. So their sexual assault imprisonment maximum is slightly less than New South Wales. Their indecent assault is slightly higher. So as I said before, as you go state to state, and I've delivered talks on sexual crime in every state and territory in Australia, there are these sort of differences. But what you'll find throughout it is the average incarceration time remains fairly consistent. But we just have these sort of slight differences around it. So going back to our discussion earlier, if a person is touched sexually without their consent, which means for a female it would be touching to the breast or between the legs, male touch between the legs, or somebody forces you to touch them sexually. Also, if somebody rubs himself against you sexually, it could be on a bus or a train or something such as that. This is what we call sort of like indecent assault, unlawful sexual touching. That's the sort of terminology around that. New South Wales, that's up to 5 years imprisonment for each one.
Can I just say,
yeah.
If you're young, if you're 19 and you've done those 5 years, that's a long time.
Yeah, and now let's just be clear. Also, you may not get the 5, but you may well get a custodial sentence, meaning you're sent to prison.
Well, it's on your name as well.
Well, this is the other point about consequence. You go to if you're convicted of a crime, that stays with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Because you are now under the umbrella that we've been speaking about, you are now a convicted sex offender. Yeah. If you commit a sexual crime against somebody who's under legal age of consent, you're a convicted child sex offender.
Yeah.
And you go on the child sex offender register. So as we start going down this path of consequence for young people crossing this line, and they're mainly young men, of course, and we've spoken about this at length in different contexts, there are massive, often sadly irreversible consequences for those who are targeted for these crimes. And we've spoken about that. This particular part of the podcast is putting the spotlight back on those who commit these crimes.
Yeah.
So there's potential imprisonment. There's a potential of what happens in prison to those who are sent there for committing sexual crimes. And this is probably not an appropriate forum to go into that in too much detail, but there is a reason why sexual offenders in the prison system are generally kept in isolation, solitary confinement, because of the treatment which is meted out to them in the general population. But we don't need to go into that too much further. That's a very dark area. Then, once that imprisonment term is completed, that person, that, let's say, young man, now a few years older, comes out of prison, will be a convicted sex offender for the rest of their life. Now, how does that then reflect on their capacity for employment?
Oh my God.
Travel. There is very few countries in the Western world that will allow you to walk off a plane into that country with a criminal conviction of a sexual crime in Australia. Very, very few.
And doesn't it, even just a normal conviction, you struggle to get into America, I think?
You can with some, yeah. You've now got to disclose anything. If you don't disclose it, they check it anyway, and it's all there. It's everywhere, and there can be all sorts of offences. What's more common, actually, interestingly, with that American type thing, is people who, when they're filling out their immigration card, say that they haven't been convicted of a crime, or in fact they have, because it's so long ago they think, no one's going to know. Then they go through immigration in America and they're on Interpol going, well, when you were 17, you were charged with this and you were convicted, so you've lied on your immigration form. Not only will they send you back to Australia, you'll be stamped on your passport never to return.
Right.
And there are people that has happened to. So I mean that's for just ticking the wrong box on an immigration form. Don't even start to think about the likelihood of getting in to get a a visitor's visa or a work visa if you've got a sexual crime again. You forget it. You've got spiders all over you. No one's going to touch you.
And just any job, really.
Any job. So many jobs in Australia that you apply for will do a criminal history check prior to your application, and they're entitled to do it to a certain degree. So jobs like, police, fire, ambulance, Army, Navy, Air Force, teaching, all these jobs. So many companies that I do work for in my capacity doing corporate work will do criminal history checks on people who are applying to get jobs there. That will be alongside the name of one of these people for the rest of their life. They don't rub this out after a couple of years. So, look, when I speak to young men about this, one of the things I do around discussing decision making, choice and consequence, legal interpretation. One component of what I talk about is consequence, the actual legal consequences of punishment, because it's massive, it's huge.
You're not even talking about the social consequences as well.
Yeah.
Like, what are your family going to think? What are your friends going to think?
All that.
What is anyone in your life going to think?
And the scary thing, often, Byron, when we talk about this, is it can often relate to a heartbeat decision made by a young man down the back of a party after a few drinks, motivated to try and big note himself to his friends back in the lounge room. And he makes an appallingly bad decision which leads to him doing something without consent sexually, say to a young woman, which has massive ramifications for that young woman, but can also have massive ramifications for that young man.
It's a lose-lose situation. The guy's now in prison. She's now got trauma through this and is going to struggle to trust people. She's going to have lots of different problems around it. There's no one benefits. And I often say, and I try not to be, and I hope I'm not melodramatic in this. I've worked in this field way too long to need to be melodramatic or something. But I often find myself saying to young men, fellas, every choice that you make in life has consequences. It's the same for young women as well. But here, we're talking about what is primarily, almost exclusively, a male issue. Yeah.
And every choice that you make in life has consequences, good and bad. If you make a bad choice under the umbrella that I work in, the consequences are absolutely massive and life-changing. And one thing I often say to young men is, sadly, almost every talk I do to young women come forward to disclose to me that they have been the subject of a sexual offence, almost exclusively by a guy of similar age to them, who they know socially, who they thought they could trust. Many of whom didn't realise that until they've sat in this talk. Now, if we look at that, these are young women walking out of my seminars. I speak to 1,000 students a week with a choice to make. And their choice is, goodness me, I think I'm going to go home and tell mum about this, or tell dad about this, or speak to my parents about it. The reason I hadn't before this is I didn't even know what my options were. And I say to young men, boys, you never, ever want to be the subject of those discussions, because this starts a domino process. Because, a young girl that goes through my talk yesterday or tomorrow, I'm speaking to a whole heap of young women tomorrow, and if tomorrow's the same as all the other days I do talks, young girls will come forward. They'll walk out of my talk with a realisation that a young guy, probably in their same age, their year group, has committed an offence against them, which is a criminal offence.
Who they may see at lunch right after. Exactly.
Then they're sitting at home, sitting now with mum and dad. I'm a parent. I have a son and a daughter. And parents hear this. Parents will sometimes then choose to pick up the phone, some of them, and call the police. Now the police get involved. Now we have an investigation. Now we have a young man getting a knock on the door. And you get a knock on the door and you open it, and there's a couple of detectives from the sex crimes unit. Well, this is a heartbeat decision made at a party 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, which is now you're coming face to face with the consequences. And it's not all about this. This is not the only component. This is a component amongst many, many others in this discussion. But it needs to be, particularly with young men, part of the component. Byron, you sat through my talk at high school. You sat in a talk that I gave at Menai, probably year 10 and year 11. And one of the things that stays with you today, all these years later, is, we walked out of there, okay.
Yeah.
This is a wake-up call. This is not because you and your friends were planning to go out and do this.
No, of course not.
It's because you and your friends are going, goodness, we've never been told this before. We never associated this with that, which has this consequence.
It's just because you never thought about it. And so to have that information laid out in front of you, go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was about to live the rest of my life without thinking about any of this stuff. You know, and now that I have that information, and that goes back to what we said before in that example, that heartbeat decision. Had he had this information, would he have made that heartbeat decision? Yeah. He full well may have.
Sure.
But also, if he had this information, he might not have, and we could have prevented that both lose-lose scenario.
Yeah, I often, I think to myself, and this is another podcast that no doubt we'll do down the track, where I talk to the boys about what's behind poor decisions that young men make, and it's peer pressure, it's fear of losing face in front of your friends, it can be alcohol. And I often think to myself, when I hear these stories, we have yet another example of another young man imposing himself intimately on a young woman without her consent, whose head is often full of justification that this is okay, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm entitled to this. All girls say no. That's, what did she come outside for? If I can just put pressure on her, she'll stop saying no, that's consent. So we've got all these different pieces to this. None of it justifies it. But there's always a part of me that thinks, if we can do these talks, if we can get this information out, if we can get up in front of the young men, particularly in this discussion, and add another voice which can contribute to the choices that they make. And that's a voice of decency. That's a voice of understanding of the law. And if that voice is just down the back and they can start hearing it, as you say, this could just be enough to tip the scales to prevent a person making a horrendous choice that impacts upon another person and in fact themselves. And I stress again, not knowing this, not having these talks is no justification for crossing that line. But the reality is, many, many people listening to this podcast or the others that we've done, if they're going to be honest, would say, goodness, I didn't know some of these definitions. I didn't know the legal definition of consent. I didn't know the legal definition of sexual intercourse. If you don't know the definitions, the lines that you draw to cross over is different to where the law is. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. It's just, it is what it is. So consequence makes up part of the discussion that we have to have with those who are at high risk of crossing that line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, as men, we have a responsibility to be talking about this and raising awareness around it. Something I got a lot of people messaging me after our episode, and a common theme I got from young women messaging me was, and I got a lot of comments on this saying, it's so refreshing to see two men talking about this topic. And that didn't even cross their mind. I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't even think about that. And so that was another reason I wanted to,
Yeah, look, my view on that, and you're right, I don't do this any better than anyone else could. I just perhaps, as a male, I perhaps do this differently to if I was sitting here and I was female. It's not better and worse. It's just different. And I think we do hear quite rightly and sadly, understandably, a lot of female voices talking about this awful stuff because it's from their side of the gender divide that they're usually targeted for this. I think it's really, really important that we have strong male voices also.
I agree.
Not that our voice is any better or of any more value than anyone else's, but yeah, men need to talk to other men about what it is that we as men do.
Exactly. And look, women feel safer when they see men talking about this. They feel like there's hope when they can see other men talking about this, and you need to have figures in both genders. I think it's super important, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of fun with this podcast. I think there's so much value packed in here. Hopefully, we'll launch this, see how it goes. Maybe do a season 2.
Sure.
We could even do a separate season for the men, separate season for the girls.
Yeah,
you
sure.
can talk about your self-defense stuff. I
Yeah,
know
yeah.
we got a lot of comments on TikTok saying back off, or I don't know, like
There's
throat,
a bit of that.
nose. I don't know. I didn't learn it, but
Yeah, it's interesting. I've done this a long time, and all of the schools I go into still get me to do my talks gender specifically, and some would be very quick to say, oh well, that's not politically correct and stuff. And my motivation is not linked to political correctness. My motivation is to how can I best service these young people I'm in front of for 2 hours, 3 hours, or whatever it is. And for me, until it's proven differently, the best way to address this in a standing up face-to-face presentation is to bring young women into the room to discuss this, who then feel comfortable as young women raising questions and asking about examples, and then bring the young men in. What's really interesting is now and again schools have said, look, can we bring groups together? Interestingly, tomorrow I'm at a school where I'm doing a session with the boys, one with the girls, then we're coming together.
oh yeah, nice.
And what's really interesting is I will get 10 times more questions from the boys' session and the girls' session than I will when they come together.
Because they don't feel safe.
Yeah,
or
and it's like people say,
awkward.
but people need to hear this when they're in together. Young men need to hear the version, young women's view on this. Women need to hear the version, the young men on this. That's great, and that's fantastic. I've done it. I've done these talks 25 years, and I can tell you that oftentimes when you bring young people together, the interaction just falls to almost zero because people are really uncomfortable to put their hand up to ask something. So for me, the reason I do gender-specific talks is out of respect of the genders I'm speaking to. And I know
a safe place.
Create a safe place for the young women and for the young men. And I know a lot of questions that are raised in my talks with young women tomorrow, like the ones I did yesterday, wouldn't be raised if you had 2 or 3 guys sitting in the room. Even when male teachers come in to a girls' session, hands go down.
Wow, really?
And with boys. I can have a boys' session going, me chatting, couple of, maybe male staff, and they change because they've got to go off and teach a class.
Yeah.
A female staff member comes in, 3 or 4 guys up the back look at each other, put their hand down. So it's not a criticism of the staff, the boys or anything.
No,
it's just a reality that sometimes discussions around this sort of stuff are best done in a specific way that maximises the impact that you can have. Then those 2 groups can go outside and chat and stuff because they've got the same information, but how they got it was respectful of the fact that they got it in a certain way and had access to hands up and coming forward. Girls that want to come forward at the end of a session to talk to me about having had something happen to them, are they going to be comfortable doing that if the guy that's done it to them is sitting in the back row watching?
Imagine how comfortable you'd be if he's sitting near you.
They're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's all these reasons, and that's why you'll hear often from the girls this, that, and the guys going, "What's that? Well,
that happened to me. I remember specifically. It's so weird. I remember these things at the bus stop after your talk. The girls came up and they're like, "Oh, grab my wrist." And because you taught them some technique to break free, and so grab my wrist, and then they twist their hand or something, and they break free of the grip. Yeah.
So, well, like you say, maybe down the track, there's room for us to do some stuff that can be accessed by those gender specifically. So, but let's hope that that these podcasts that we've put together more recently are ones that answer a lot of questions, but even not just answer questions, but promote discussion and chat, and then we'll evaluate that and see, okay, what do we do going forward? I mean, we're sort of here today because of a lot of the feedback that we got from the last podcast that we did was with that 1:45 minute, that 1 hour
like an
talk.
hour or something.
And I'm sure today we'll promote even more discussion, and we'll see where it takes us.
I hope so. And I would say, to anyone listening, get your friends to listen to this. Have a discussion around it. If anything out of this, just have a discussion about it. Yeah. Try promote this education, because I think if more people could hear this sort of stuff, we could actually drastically lower sexual crimes happening. I hope. I don't know if that's not based on anything. That's just based on a hunch, because I think by providing this education, at least now people are aware of what's happening, and there's a lot of awareness happening right now, and I think it's going to dissipate over the next few months, whereas this is going to stay. Education is going to stay, where we can really try to promote that and really try to make a change. So that's my hope. Are there any final thoughts that you want to say to the listeners?
Nothing that comes to mind, but just listen in, and if there's any queries, any discussion that comes out of this, I think that's only going to be a good thing. And this is not the last time that we'll do this. We'll get together again moving forward and say, okay, how can we improve on what we've done, and maybe go down some different pathways. But I think the podcasts that we've put together in this particular series are going to really cover a lot of very important information.
I agree. But otherwise, that's it from me.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you guys in season 2. Thanks, Brent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making it all the way through this episode. After hearing the contents of this podcast, many may realize the sad reality of what has happened to them. If this is you and you seek help or guidance on what to do next, please click the link in the show notes. It'll redirect you to some resources as well as a helpline if you want to talk to someone anonymous. As you'll hear in other episodes, Brent and I do mention how important it is to start talking to someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, or it could be someone anonymous on a helpline. They are trained professionals, and we highly recommend you start this conversation. As you'll hear as well, in no way do you have to report this crime. This is completely up to you, but know that there are resources and links provided in the show notes below should you seek guidance.